Welcome to the Berkley Center, the Berkley Center For Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown. My name is Tom Banshoff. I'm the director of the center. We've been around now 5 years. It's hard to believe. 5 years this month. And as many of you know, we've had a chance to come to our events and follow our work. We're part of an effort here at Georgetown. We're located in the president's office, part of an institutional effort to really make the university a leader in the study of religion as it intersects with global policy challenges like development, democracy, war, and peace. And as you know, there's already a proliferation of books related to this topic, but we're here today to really celebrate a milestone. There's a lot of edited books floating around, and we're guilty of distributing a few of those from our center. But what you've got here with God's Century is a multi-authored volume, 3 authors who worked together intensively and produced a great work of, I would say, synthetic scholarship on the role of religion in world affairs today. A book with a clear argument about not just that religion is important, but how, when, and why it matters. So we've got 3 impressive voices, but I think one overarching message, as you'll see when you'll take a look at the book, as you'll hear today in our conversation. I just got another copy from the publisher asking me to write a review. I'm probably not going to do that. I don't have the arm's length that I would need to do that. But I encourage you to have a look at the book on the way out. If you haven't seen already, we've got someone from the bookstore providing copies on your way out. On the right, you can also learn some more about the center and its programs.
For sale.
I think bookstore made that clear, but you're right, yeah. For sale, right outside the door. I'm especially glad that Monica and Dan are with us today. They've been frequent guests at the center and are part of our new religious freedom project that Tom Farr, my friend and colleague, directs. But I'm particularly delighted that Tim is with us, Tim Shah, who has also been a frequent guest of the center, but now is part of our community. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Government and associate director of the Religious Freedom Project here at Georgetown. So it's always wonderful to celebrate the accomplishment of a colleague. I'd also like to thank Ross Douthat for joining us, and he'll be providing some commentary. And Michael Cromartie, who I will now introduce, who will be moderating the discussion. Michael's known to many of you, I think, as one of our leading scholars and practitioners at the intersection of religion and politics, both nationally and internationally. He served for 6 years on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, including a stint as the chair of that very important body. So Michael, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to the discussion.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you have a bio in your packet, and I'm not one of those moderators who then turns around and starts reading to you the very thing that's in your lap. So I trust you've read the bios and know about our distinguished panel. I would just note everyone on our panel, can you hear this? Is it working? Everyone on our panel either teaches at Harvard, went to Harvard, has a PhD from Harvard, or went to Harvard and wrote a book about their experience at Harvard. No one on our panel, however, is the inventor of Facebook.
There's a lawsuit pending, actually.
Ross intersected with the founder of Facebook. Let me just quickly say that Tim Shah is the Associate Director and Scholar in Residence of the Religious Freedom Program here at the Berkley Center. Tim formerly worked at Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. His PhD is in Political Theory from Harvard. He'll be our first discussant. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all 3 of our panelists and our respondent. And then the ground rules are simply this, that when they finish, and each of them will be held strictly to at least 5 to 7 minute comments. If they go over, I'll begin tapping on the table here. After they finish, then we want to have a dialogue with you. And so if you'll raise your hand, I'll keep a list of people who want to get in, and I'll get you in as quickly as I can. Dan Philpott is an associate scholar with the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center and also an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Notre Dame. He also received his PhD from Harvard. Monica Toft is an associate professor of public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. She's also the director of the Initiative on Religion and International Affairs at Harvard's Belfer Center and associate scholar with the Religious Freedom Project. We couldn't have any more distinguished people to comment on the subject of this new book, God's Century, Resurgent Religion and Global Politics, than our speakers today. When they finish, Ross Douthat, as you know, is an op-ed columnist with the New York Times. He previously was a senior editor at The Atlantic and a blogger at theatlantic.com. He is the author of his experiences at Harvard, the book called Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class. And he co-wrote with Rehan Salam the book Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. More importantly, in the last month, Ross is the father of Gwendolyn Patricia Douthat, who was born about a month ago. Thank you, Ross, for taking time from being a good dad to join us today and to finally responding to my emails. First, from Tim Shaw.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom Banshaw. Thank you, Mike Cromartie. Thank you to my co-authors and to Ross Douthat and to all of you for being here. Forgive me that I'm going to mention Harvard yet again. As a graduate student in political science at Harvard in the fall of 1992, I had to take an introductory course on global politics. And the first book I distinctly remember reading in that course was called The Passing of Traditional Society by Daniel Lerner. I vividly recall, not a lot from the course, but I vividly recall Daniel Lerner's sweeping conclusion about what modernity would mean for traditional culture and for Islam in particular. Islam in the Middle East, Lerner concluded, and I'm quoting, is, quote, absolutely defenseless in the face of the rationalist spirit of modernity. Lesson number one for me as a graduate student in political science, in other words, was that modernization inevitably equals secularization in the Middle East just as much as in other parts of the world. I don't know exactly how many of my graduate school classmates went on to the State Department or the Defense Department or the RAND Corporation or the White House or Capitol Hill, but I know some of them did. Wherever they worked, the view of global politics in which they were immersed, in which I was immersed, was, I fear, the poorest possible preparation for the era of global politics in which we now live, the era we call in our book God's Century. All of my classmates who entered, say, the State Department had lots of political economy, political sociology, international security, theories of democratization crammed into their heads, and were well prepared to analyze almost any conceivable global political problem in an informed way. But the one thing they did not have crammed into their heads was any understanding of religion. Though Islam was supposed to be, quote, absolutely defenseless in the face of modernity, here we are today, mesmerized by the events of an Arab Spring, where in country after country, case after case, a central question is what are the true political intentions of the various Islamic groups flooding into the foreground, now that so many authoritarian lids are being blown off across the Middle East, from Egypt to Libya, from Yemen to Bahrain. These groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islah Party in Yemen, and many others, may not always be leading the pro-freedom charge. Yet the religious leanings of the masses have been visible everywhere, as, for example, when Sheikh Qaradawi, a senior cleric in Egypt, addressed praying crowds of Egyptians in Tahrir Square at the enormous victory rally on February 18th. He praised the, quote, youth of the revolution, which, quote, has lifted the head of this country and made us proud once again. And I think not inaccurately, he called the young people who made the revolution, quote, the new partisans of God. In other words, demonstrably religious young people, partisans of God, have made a political revolution that our secular, sophisticated political science did not anticipate. And this revolution raises questions for which our secular policy frameworks have few, if any, answers. On the contrary, not only do our policy frameworks generate no answers, they condition us to believe either that groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood do not matter, or that such groups are alien and abnormal and should make us panic. Which is to say that my Harvard-trained classmates and I were far worse than ignorant, because we not only failed to learn about religion, but we were trained to be unable to think about it clearly and constructively. Yet again, where are we now? Now, the true character of the Islam that was supposed to be absolutely defenseless in the face of modernization has become a central issue, if not the central issue, as we navigate the new Middle East. And yet again, how many of our analysts of international relations, our makers of foreign policy, have the background, the paradigms, the tools for developing a fine-grained analysis of these partisans of God? How many of us can think clearly and knowledgeably about the resurgence of religion that has so surprised us? How many of us are remotely ready for God's century? After all, the 21st century most of us thought was coming was supposed to look very, very different. It was supposed to look, well, a lot like the century we already had, in which the world's most cutting-edge and consequential political forces were anything but self-proclaimed partisans of God. On the contrary, the cutting-edge agents and actors sweeping across global politics in the 20th century were more often than not the opposite of self-proclaimed partisans of God, and were far more frequently the self-proclaimed enemies of God. This may sound like an exaggeration, but if you look back at the 20th century, it is not. Consider one Mexican politician, Tomás Garrido Canabal. In many ways, Tomás Canabal was an apt symbol of 20th century politics, the politics of the last century. In the mid-1920s, about 10 years after the radically anti-clerical Mexican Revolution, Canabal became the governor of Tabasco State in the south of the country. He made it such an important plank of his political platform to rid Tabasco State of what he called clerical opium that he made it illegal to wear a crucifix or even to say adios, because adios has Dios in it. He even proudly handed out little calling cards that described himself as, quote, the personal enemy of God, a habit I think that would have limited his networking opportunities, but he was a man of strong conviction. This may sound outlandish, but it's actually a good example of the political ideologies and trends that became increasingly common and influential in global politics from the time of the anti-clerical French Revolution in 1789 until they became largely a spent force by the time of the pro-clerical Iranian Revolution of 1979. As we describe in detail in God's Century, secularist movements and ideologies were far more the norm than the exception in world politics, beginning in the 19th century and swept over every part of the world in the 20th century, peaking in influence, we argue, between 1917 and 1967. Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, Ataturk's Turkish Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, Mao's Cultural Revolution, Nasser's Pan-Arab Revolution, the Shah of Iran's White Revolution, the viciously anti-religious Cambodian Revolution. Revolution after revolution, ideology after ideology was bent on attacking or at least containing the power of religion in every region of the world. Indeed, the success of these political enemies of God helped to make it seem that secularization was the wave of the future. They made it seem that religion was a dying supernova. There we go. Enjoying its penultimate glow before disappearing from history. They made it easily forgivable to think of the 20th century as the godless century, at least as far as politics was concerned, making it increasingly common to ask whether God was dead, as Time magazine famously did, as you can see here in 1966. But today, what's happened to these political ideologies and movements? They're largely a spent force. The politics of secularization has less of the world in its grip than perhaps any time since the early 19th century, we argue. And yet, if the politics of secularization has gone into steep decline, the theory of secularization is remarkably stubborn. There is evidence that it still has much of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, trained at lingering bastions of secularization theory, like, yes, Harvard, very much in its grip. On February 10th, for example, our Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, was testifying about the situation in Egypt before a congressional committee, and he told this committee that the Muslim Brotherhood is, quote, a largely secular organization. With equal glibness, other analysts have declared that the Brotherhood is a scary sect, just waiting to establish a violent theocracy. Or some people clearly just can't think calmly or coherently at all when any kind of religion appears on the horizon. When the Washington Post's David Ignatius was in Tahrir Square for the February 18th victory rally, he found the mere sight of ordinary Egyptians staging mass prayers unnerving. Such is the subtlety of our secularist outlooks, which regard religious people either as not really religious at all, or else as irrational, violent, and frightening. In God's Century, we argue that if American foreign policymakers want to promote democracy and stability, they must come to realize that secularism is a poor analytical tool. Despite a powerful array of secularizing regimes, ideologies, and social trends, the self-proclaimed partisans of God outlasted and politically outcompeted the self-proclaimed enemies of God. Part of what happened is that being a determined enemy of God, like Senor Cannibal from Tabasco with his little calling cards, just didn't turn out to be the growth industry it was supposed to be. So if you're an investor in ideological movements at the beginning of the 20th century, all the trends would have told you to invest in atheism and agnosticism. But if you had done that, you would have lost a lot of money, as you can see from these graphs based on data collected by Todd Johnson, the world's most distinguished religious demographer. After 1970, this graph shows you actually see a very steep decline in the percentage of the world's population that is agnostic. Similarly, you see a similar decline after 1970 in the percentage of the world's population that is atheist. But on the other hand, if you had invested in religion and you, say, dispersed your investment across a broad portfolio of the world's largest religious communities, well, you would have done very well, as this table shows, and much, much better than Daniel Lerner, for example, would have predicted you would do for Islam. Virtually all the world's major religious traditions, contrary to expectation, contrary prediction, claim a larger percentage of global adherents today than at the beginning of the 20th century. There are a couple of exceptions, such as really one major exception, Buddhists, but otherwise the world's largest religious communities are actually a larger chunk of the global population than they were only 100 years ago, a remarkable fact. So how did this happen? Ironically, the resurgence of religion has been empowered by three trends that secularization theory predicted would bury religion. The first is modernization. Religion was supposed to wither as people became modern, as people were socialized into an industrialized urban society in which each individual would exercise control over his or her fate. In 1968, for example, the sociologist of religion Peter Berger predicted that communities of faith would dwindle and that the religious faithful would be left isolated, huddled together, quote, in small sects to resist a worldwide secular culture. 30 years later, he retracted his thesis. Even among people in advanced industrialized countries, it's now clear, more than 60% claim that religion remains important to them. In other countries, it's more like 80 or 90%. The second trend is democratization, which took off in the early 1970s. In contrast to many authoritarian regimes that were sometimes self-proclaimed enemies of God, which sought to eradicate or subjugate religious actors, democracies usually gave religious actors much greater room to enter politics and compete for influence. The final trend is globalization. People and ideas now travel across the globe at a much greater rate, at a much greater volume. As transnational actors, not confined to any single state, religious actors are well positioned to harness new technologies and innovations and project their influence across borders. This global resurgence of religion, until recently either denied or ignored, is thus an established political reality. But this takes us to the big question. Is, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood's greater civic role in a more open Egypt to be feared or welcomed? We argue that two factors are crucial to arriving at a fine-grained answer. The first is the political theology any given religious actor espouses. Does that theology give the group a right or a warrant to challenge political authority? If yes, does the group's political theology make it legitimate to challenge that authority with violence? The second critical factor is the freedom religious actors enjoy vis-a-vis state authority. Religious actors with some semblance of freedom have been able to play peaceful and accommodating roles, advancing democracy or building peace in conflict-ridden societies. Dan Philpott, in a few minutes, will discuss the peaceful and democratic potential of religion in some detail in his remarks. But there is, of course, another converse side to the relationship between religious groups and political authority. We have found that marginalized or suppressed groups, those with little freedom of action, often resort to violence as the only available political alternative. And in a moment, we'll turn to Monica Toft, who's going to explore for us in more detail the dynamic relationship between religion and violence. What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that in God's century, the unfolding 21st century of politically resurgent religion, we can no longer afford to hang on to the secularization theories that are the holdover of a long-gone era. They not only make us ignorant, they make us stupid. And stupidity is something we can ill afford as we design policy for numerous societies, from Libya to Egypt, Iran, and Pakistan, where these societies are being reshaped by the partisans of God. Thank you. Monica?
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Tom and Tom, for hosting us today. It's really a pleasure, and for such a terrific turnout. So I have the task of presenting some of the empirical work that we conducted in this book, and it's really the first sustained, we think, and accounting of actually how religious actors and institutions have influenced the play of global politics, actually over the past couple of centuries. We trace actually the global resurgence, as Tim said, to the 1960s, 1970s. And what I'm going to do is go over two of the empirical chapters on religion and violence, large-scale violence. And there have been two types, and these are the dominant types of violence that plague the world today, and that's civil wars and terrorism, both of which have been increasing since the 1970s, and both are actually quite destructive. And it turns out that religiously inspired violence, both of the civil war type and the terrorism type, are more destructive than their secular brethren. And both mapped the trends that Tim highlighted of modernization, globalization, and democratization. And Dan's going to cover the democratization piece even more so. So what we found was critical in explaining religiously inspired violence is the nature of the political theology of the actors, which a lot of people just ignore, or they sort of dismiss it, that it's being instrumentalized, that people are acting or motivated for instrumental reasons to seize power. And we say, no, actually, the political theology of the actors is absolutely critical, and you need to understand it. So does the political theology of the actors that you're examining accept the use of violence in pursuit of political goals? If they do, then chances are, if given the opportunity, they will pursue violence to achieve those political goals. But second, and it's related, it's a relationship, it turns out that it matters in which states they're operating. And if they are operating in states that tend to prey on religious actors or repress religious actors or marginalize them, the way Tim mentioned, or tend to favor one religious group over another, then it gives cause to religious actors to turn to violence. So let's start with civil wars. So as I mentioned, if you look at the trend, religiously inspired civil wars have seen an uptick not since 2000, not since 1980, but actually started in the 1970s. Although only about a third of all civil wars have a religious basis, and what we mean by that, and we explain this is in the book, is that either the actors who were fighting the civil war belonged to different faith traditions. Religion wasn't necessarily central, it was part of the fight. You can think about Sri Lanka between Buddhists and Hindus, or between Catholics and Orthodox and Muslims in former Yugoslavia. Religion was peripheral, but it was still there. And it still influenced the play of the violence in the sense that churches and mosques were part of the battlefield, but so were the division of peoples and who was on which side. And then in some, religion is absolutely central, and here we can think about Afghanistan today, and also Tajikistan in the 1990s. Since 1940, there's been about 42 religiously inspired civil wars, and today they make up about half of all ongoing civil wars. And their proportion seems to be increasing. In some cases, religion moves from a peripheral issue to a central issue. So we recently had the referendum in Sudan. The Southern Sudanese are now free. It's an independent state which will be sanctioned this summer. And in that case, from 56 to 72, religion was peripheral. Actually, the Southern Sudanese just wanted greater autonomy and respect of basic rights, including religion, the ability to practice Christianity or their animist traditions. But in the Second War, religion was much more central as the North, Khartoum, tried to impose an Islamist regime. And the similar dynamics we find in Chechnya as well. The First War was largely a self-determination struggle. The Second War, Islam became much more central. So why should we be concerned about these civil wars? They are only about a third of all civil wars. We point out a number of reasons and give some data. First of all, religious civil wars last longer, on average, than regular civil wars or non-religiously based civil wars. Regular civil wars are bad enough. They last on average about 7 years. Religious civil wars last on average about 9 years. They're less amenable to negotiated settlements, meaning that the sides fight to the bitter end. It's very hard to get the two sides to come to a negotiation. Dan's going to talk about that a bit more when he gets to peace and reconciliation. They're more likely to recur. So once you get the war ended, the combatants actually are more likely down the road to pick up arms. And you can think about Chechnya, again. It's a war that's recurred and it still has not ended, as the tragic bombings in the Moscow airport most recently pointed out, and also Sudan. And finally, they're more deadly to non-combatants. There seems to be a situation in which gloves are taken off and anybody is prey to the violence. So why? Why are we seeing this disproportionate increase in religious civil wars vis-a-vis non-religious civil wars? Well, again, we go back to our macro level argument about these global trends. First of all, modernization failed. So if you think about the decolonization period, there was big promises of secular ideologies, communism, socialism, to deliver the goods, and they failed. Religious authorities in many of these states were repressed, pushed under, but they remained legitimate and had some authority. And so when you started seeing fissures in these regimes in the 1970s, where we started really seeing regimes being challenged, religious actors stepped into the fore and started saying, well, maybe if these secular ideologies didn't work, we can offer something by way of religious ideas. The second is democratization, which is related to the opening up of these political systems, and Dan, again, is going to go into that more. And people started demanding that religion play a more public role. And so you started seeing religious actors, if they weren't walking into the political arena, being pulled into the political arena. And survey after survey shows in many countries, not in all countries, we're very careful, in many countries that populations are demanding that their political elites, their public officials, display religious beliefs or be adherents of some religious faith. There's the joke in the United States that it's easier to get elected if you're Mormon than if you're atheist. You cannot be an atheist in this country and get elected. That's what the surveys show. But even more importantly, for our macro level argument for some of these dynamics, is the changes in political theology that allowed this to happen, right? Dan's going to talk about the Vatican a bit in the 1960s, which allowed people throughout Latin America and Catholic countries to challenge political authorities, that you had to be representative and protective of citizens' rights. The Iranian Revolution, it is one of the true theological revolutions, in the sense that Shia were now allowed to challenge political authority. They did not have to be passive martyrs. It was a change in political theology that allowed people to challenge states. And unfortunately, sometimes it turns violent, and we have civil wars that emerge. And then a last bit, it turns out one of the data points that we have to contend with in the book is the disproportionate representation of Muslim societies or Islam in violence, both civil wars and in terrorism. And there was a reinterpretation of jihad, that it became a collective responsibility to protect fellow Muslims, not only at home, but also abroad. And this sort of helped the dynamics of violence. So let me turn to terrorism now, religiously inspired terrorism. And again, it tracks to the core arguments about globalization. In this case, globalization is a much more feeder into sort of what we're witnessing today, what we call global jihad, modernization and democratization, which provided a catalyst for religious terrorism by increasing the expectations of people that they should determine their own destiny, and also increasing their capacity to do so. And we can talk about the technological revolution, but also the ability of people to move across borders much more easily. Religious actors who resort to terrorism and other extreme acts of violence have often experienced some type of alienation, marginalization, or repression. And typically, it is the result of the state, which tries to contain or even suppress religious actors in the public arena, and even sometimes in the private arena. We can talk about conscience. We're all part of this religious freedom, trying to actually, even in the private arena, contain that. So in a number of Muslim countries, how Islam is practiced is dictated by the state, while in other countries, states work hard to get rid of religion altogether. You can think of the communist regimes, prior to the 1990s, or perhaps even today, China's relationship with the Falun Gong. It's very, very nervous because it's an alternative authority structure. For those terrorists inspired by religion, violence is seen as a sacramental act, a divine duty, an obligation. And they see it as a response to a theological demand or imperative. It often assumes a transcendental dimension. Only a couple of years ago, a couple of years after 2001, I was asked by 9/11, a senior colleague in international relations, Monica, does religion really matter? And what I say to him time and again, go read Muhammad Atta's letter. Take it seriously. He really believed he was on a divine mission. So not only is terrorism seen as morally justified and a necessary expedient for the attainment of the terrorist goals, it also provides the motivation and organizational structure for terrorists. Prior to the 1980s, there were almost no religious terrorists or actions or activities. It was mainly secular leftists. You can think about the Baader-Meinhof brigades in Europe, for instance. However, after the 1990s, the numbers increased and increased proportionally from the 80s, 90s, and into this century. In 1980, I'm using Bruce Hoffman's data here. 4% of known international terrorist organizations had a religious basis. By 1994, it increased almost tenfold to 33%. 1995, 46%, and today about 50%. As with civil wars, religiously inspired terrorism is also more deadly, almost 3 times. Whereas secular groups tend to kill on average 3 to 4 people and wound another 8 to 16, religious terrorists tend to kill 16 people per attack and wound another 39. So here's, again, political theology is very important. One of the reasons for this is the justification of suicide, terrorism, and martyrdom. They can inject themselves into a room like this more readily and justify their killing. The political theology matters. So as transnational actors, international terrorists, just to give you a sense, Salafi jihadists, these are Islamic groups, are responsible for, have been responsible in this century for 70% of all attacks. And actually, this is data from Asaf Moghadam, the proportion is going up. It's probably around 80% now. These data only go to 2007. Whereas they tended to be local actors in the 1980s fighting local battles, especially after the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, religious terrorism has become a global phenomenon. Or more precisely, we call it a global one, in which local issues become linked to global ones, as in the case of foreign fighters who spontaneously and foreign terrorists, and most often uninvited, joined fights to defend fellow Muslims. If you consider the reorientation of U.S. foreign policy in the last 2 decades, it's Afghanistan fighting al-Qaeda, and now, of course, we have the Arab Spring. It was the result, not the Arab Spring, the Afghanistan and fighting al-Qaeda, the result of religiously inspired violence that continues today. But I'm going to end it here because it turns out the resurgence of violence is only one part of what we're seeing in terms of the resurgence of religion in global politics. There is a good side. Dan gets to present that, and that's trends in democratization and peace and reconciliation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Monica and Tim. If religion's political influence were confined to civil war and terrorism, it might well confirm at least part of the secularization thesis. I have in mind the claim of the neo-atheists like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens that where religion persists, it is violent and irrational. But part of the great surprise of religion's resurgence is that it has been a forceful instrument also of tearing down dictatorships, promoting democracy, mediating peace, and healing the wounds of war and dictatorship, quite the opposite of violence. We also found that religious actors have become a force for democracy and peace when they possess the mirror opposite characteristics of religious actors who foment violence, namely independence from the state and a political theology that itself prescribes democracy, peace, and reconciliation as expressions of religious belief. Consider democracy. In 78 cases of democratization since 1972, religion has contributed strongly in 48, that's 48 out of 78 cases we find. If you're old enough, you will remember Pope John Paul II's pilgrimages to communist Poland beginning in 1979, where he preached to hundreds of thousands. But not just any old homily. Rather, in terms that were unmistakable to Poles, he challenged the legitimacy of the regime. Or recall the Protestants who gathered in the Nikolai Kirche in Leipzig in November 1989, or the Muslim leaders in Indonesia who helped to bring down Suharto in 1998. This was not supposed to happen, according to the secularization thesis. Democracy, with its open debate and its popular control, was supposed to have exposed religion as a crutch for primitive people. Surprisingly, though, religion has profited from precisely the open debate and room to operate that democracy affords. The best squelchers of religion are, in fact, secular dictators. Religious actors are not always the supporters of democracy, though. The Catholic Church in Rwanda was acquiescent and even somewhat participatory in the genocide of 1994. What distinguishes the democratizers from the supporters of authoritarianism? The most forceful democratizers have been those religious actors who, often through determined resistance, preserved a measure of independence from the state. An example is the major Islamic movements under Suharto, the dictator who held power from 1965 to 1998 in Indonesia. Where religious actors remained cozy with the state, they had little incentive to support democracy. Examples include the Argentine Catholic Church in the late 1970s and the Buddhist Sangha in Sri Lanka. In other cases, religious actors become so suppressed by the state that they simply lack power to act independently. The Orthodox churches in the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe are illustrative. We also found that religious actors who agitate for democracy are ones whose doctrines involve a political theology that supports democracy and human rights through its very propositions. A striking trend was what the late political scientist Samuel Huntington, whom we dedicate our book to, I should add, called the Catholic wave, the preponderant role of the Catholic Church in the third wave of democratization. That's from 1972 to the present. National Catholic churches, in fact, constituted 36 out of the 48 cases of religious democratizers. What motored this trend, we argue, was an important shift in political theology, namely a full embrace of religious freedom and other human rights by the Church at the Second Vatican Council of 1962 to 1965. As for Islam, we find that democracy is still relatively rare. Only 3 out of 47 countries are ranked, Muslim-majority countries, are ranked free by Freedom House. Still, Islam has had strong democratizers in places like Turkey and Indonesia, movements with independence from the state, and a democratic political theology. It is these that hold promise for the future. Now let's look briefly at peace and reconciliation. During the past half-century, the preponderance of violence in the world has taken place in civil wars, not international wars. As Monica has shown in separate work, the period since the end of the Cold War has seen a historically high concentration of civil wars ending through negotiations. We surveyed 26 cases of peace negotiations since the end of the Cold War and find that in 11 of these 26 cases, religious actors played a strong mediating role. In 11, a weak mediating role, and in only 4 of these cases, no significant role at all. What characterized the effective mediators? Independence mattered a great deal, though here it was with respect to both the state and to the armed opponents. A political theology that placed a special stress on peace was essential too. Perhaps the quintessential religious negotiator has been the community of San Egidio, a lay community of the Catholic Church. Through befriending parties on all sides of the civil war in Mozambique over 16 years, yet affiliating with none, and through the community's political theology of peace and reconciliation, the community was able to bring all sides to the negotiating table and secure peace in 1992. It has since served as the key negotiator in Algeria, Guatemala, Liberia, Burundi, and elsewhere on the reputation of its experience in Mozambique. Can I get one forward? We also surveyed 19 cases of transitional justice. That is, countries' choices about how to deal with past crimes after a transition to peace or democracy. Common approaches include punitive justice, epitomized by the ICC, International Criminal Court, or national trials, and truth recovery, the most famous of which remains South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We found that in 8 of these cases, the boldface cases on the right-hand side of the chart, religious actors were importantly influential. In all of these cases, they favored truth recovery, though in a few cases they also favored trials. The influential ones carried a political theology of reconciliation and, once again, independence from the state. Perhaps the signature actor here is Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who had been both a leader in the anti-apartheid movement and a pioneering theologian of reconciliation. Following South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994, he rose to lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and left his stamp on it. So, to summarize, we hold that religion has made a political comeback abetted by globalization, democratization, and technological development. Those religious actors who are most closely integrated with state authority and who hold a political theology that calls for state sponsorship, the subordination of minorities, and the use of violence are most likely to be violent. Those who have remained independent of state authority and carry a political theology that prescribes democracy, peace, or reconciliation are most likely to be peaceful and democratic. Our argument has important implications for U.S. foreign policy. First, quite simply, it is essential that foreign policymakers come to understand better that religion is not going away. The 21st century is God's century. We also hold that better understanding the forces that shape the politics of the religious can help the U.S. pursue its goals of democratization, stability, or fighting terrorism much more effectively. The U.S. would know better which religious actors are likely to support these goals, which are likely to be its allies, and which are likely to stand in the way. No better illustration for this claim can be found in the current Arab Spring. What is the political role of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood likely to be? What about the Shiite crowds in Bahrain? What sort of regime do they have in mind? And what about those Libyan rebels, about whom so little is presently known? In what way are they religious, or are they? And how does this religion, if they are religious, translate into politics? Religion is far from being the only or even the most decisive factor in global politics, but it has played and will continue to play a key role. The 21st century has brought us a world radically different from the one secularization theory promised. We have no choice but to build new theories and devise fresh policy strategies for the religious age we live in, God's century, not the secular age that never came. You want to trade? Why don't you sit here? Sure.
I will weave it all together. No, listen, that's right. We should switch these around so no one is confused. Oh. They're actually going to lower a large image of my face for the duration. No, I want to thank Tim, Daniel, and Monica for having me here today to respond to their wonderful and fascinating book, and I want to thank, obviously, the Berkley Center as well. And really, a book like this for a respondent is kind of an embarrassment of riches. There's so much interesting material here, and I'm just going to, in typical respondent fashion, try to pick out two threads that I think are really worth highlighting, and then raise two questions that I think hopefully will prompt some fruitful discussion. And I'll try to be quick because I think the discussion in these cases is often more fruitful than the sort of pre-discussion talking. But so first, two compliments about areas of this book and the story it tells. And the first, I think, is something that was hinted at in the presentations, but I think could be elaborated a little bit more, which is that in Monica, Daniel, and Timothy, it's interesting to talk about a book with three authors because so many names. But what I think that they've constructed here is a very compelling historical narrative, not only of the last century or so, but really of the entire trajectory of religion and the state in modernity. And I think that they emphasize in very interesting ways the way that the interrelationship between the state and religion, the state and religious institutions and communities shaped both the sort of secularization trajectory that begins in the West in particular in the 17th century and continues through to the 20th, and then the apparent resurgence of religion in the last 40 years or so. And I think they talk about this in sort of discrete ways. They talk about the what they call the friendly merger model of essentially the state and religion, especially in talking about medieval Europe as an example, and how that gives way to what they term a friendly takeover model in the 16th and 17th century, where you have increasingly powerful centralizing states essentially assuming greater and greater authority over their religious communities. I think Catholics in 16th century England might quibble with the term friendly takeover, but still, I think the language is useful because then they contrast it with what they call the hostile takeovers of religion that began in the 18th century and continued into the 19th and early 20th, beginning with obviously the French Revolution and moving through everything from Bismarck's Kulturkampf in Germany in the 19th century to the sort of militant secularism of Mexico that Tim talked about. And what I think comes into focus when you sort of take this portrait and then pull back a bit is the extent to which it's useful in a way to understand both secularization and the resurgence of religion as a kind of tug of war between state power and religion, state power and civil society as well. And so you can see this, in a sense, you can see the story of gradual secularization as the story of centralized states trying to assume more and more control over every aspect of human affairs. And we're accustomed to thinking about this in the context of communism and fascism and sort of explicitly totalitarian movements. But I think what becomes clear in their narrative is the extent to which this was true, kind of across the board in Latin America as well as in the Soviet Union, in Bismarck's Germany as well as in Hitler's Germany, in Ataturk's Turkey as well as Mao's China, and so on. And so then it becomes useful to see, the last 40 years as sort of the failure in many cases of some of these sort of centralized experiments, especially in their socialist and Marxist variety, and then the sort of revenge of civil society almost, with religion and civil society being intertwined in interesting ways, and how that happened sort of in really across the globe in lots of different interesting ways. So that I wanted to just highlight that narrative because I think it bears greater reflection and conversation. I think it's a very interesting way to look at the story of religion and modernity. And then I want to praise just something that was, I think, very clear from their presentation, which is the extent to which this is a book that takes religion seriously, and it takes the idea that theology has consequences very seriously. And I think very often in conversations about religion, people can sort of accept that the sort of hardcore secularization hypothesis, right, the idea that, the sort of Peter Berger idea of, modernity being a world where religious communities just shrink and hide under their little umbrellas and so on. People will say, okay, well, that's probably wrong. But then I think there's sort of a second sort of step that people take where they say, well, that's wrong, and but we'll just think of it this way. There's something called religion out there. There's this big amorphous thing called religion, and it's more potent than we thought. And there's sort of good religion, which is maybe private and apolitical, or maybe it's pro-democracy and human rights. And then there's bad religion, which is public and political, or supports authoritarian regimes and so on. And there are some elements of truth to that sketch. But what I think is clear from this book is that, and I think what's clear from the world we live in, is that to really understand the interplay of religion and politics, and really the interplay of religion and human affairs more generally, you have to get a lot more specific. And you have to drill down into the content of specific religious traditions and the way the content of those traditions changes, and the impact of sort of theological beliefs on everyday actions. And, there's obviously a sort of eternal debate about what comes first, sort of political and economic conflict or religious conflict and so on. And, that's a debate people will be having until the end of time. And there's always, at which point somebody's Messiah will come back. And no, but there's all kinds of fascinating complexities to be teased out there. But again, what I think that these authors make clear is just the extent to which, whether it's, Salafist Islam versus Sufi Islam, or post-Vatican II Catholicism versus pre-Vatican II Catholicism, or Hindu nationalism versus the more quiescent forms of Hinduism, it's really important to look at the specifics of a religious tradition, and really the specifics of the way a religion's view of God and man affects how that religion's devotees carry themselves into the public sphere. So we can't understand the 21st century, or indeed any century, if we just think of sort of capital R religion, and don't narrow our focus to the way that specific religious traditions and specific theologies play themselves out in public life. So now let me raise just a couple questions that maybe will be fruitful for discussion. One question I think follows to some extent from that question of political theology, which is that, what you'll notice reading the book, and I think it was clearer as well from the way the presentation was divided up, this book has chapters on religious terrorism and religious civil war, and it has chapters on religion's role in democratization and religion's role in the promotion of human rights and humanitarian causes. And when you dig into those chapters, you will notice that in the chapters on religion's role in democratization and religion's role in human rights, the religious traditions that take up, most of the examples and most of the material tend to be Christian with some Buddhist and Hindu elements and so on. And then in the chapters on religious terrorism and religion's role in civil conflict, there's a much heavier role for Islam and Islamic societies. And this is a division that I think that the authors address, but I also think that occasionally they sort of dance around it a little bit where, for instance, on page 129, they say, while it's true that religious terrorism is disproportionately found in Islam, a focus on ideas alone obscures the role that state-religion relationships in the Muslim world play in fomenting religious terrorism. And we might conjecture, they say, that other religious actors, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, or otherwise, would respond similarly if subjected to sustained suppression. And I completely agree with that sentiment, but I also think that if we are taking theology seriously and taking sort of religious history seriously, we need to also dig into the ways, and perhaps a bit more than the authors did in this book, in the ways that, the difference between sort of Christian origins versus Muslim origins, Christian theology versus Islamic theology, plays itself out in the ways that those religious traditions relate to democracy and modernity. And I would just raise the possibility that there are, in Islamic tradition, particular challenges related to issues having to do with the separation of church and state in particular, more so, I think, than democratization qua democratization. I think those are actually somewhat separate issues. And I think Islam's compatibility with democracy is more obvious than its compatibility with church-state separation. And I think that's sort of, as we think about this set of issues, I think that's, and particularly as we think about those issues as they relate to events in the world this month and this week, I think the sort of particularities of Islam and its relationship to modernity bear perhaps more reflection. So that's one question I'd raise. Another question I'd raise is that their portrait, I think, of God-century and resurgent religion centers on religion's role in nations making democratic transitions, and second, in nations that haven't really yet made those transitions, that are often what you might say pre-modern societies still grappling with modernity in different ways. And they do discuss religion in what you might call postmodern society, Western Europe, the United States, some of the nations of the Pacific Rim. And there's sort of an attempt, I think, at times to sort of fit those two narratives together, and so talk about, the Christian right in the United States as sort of an analog to some of these expressions of political religion elsewhere around the world. And I would challenge that parallel to some extent. And I think one of the interesting questions for postmodern societies is whether what you might call a weak version of the secularization hypothesis actually still holds a certain amount of water. I think if you look at trends, if you look at trends in the United States, for instance, there's no question that in the last 40 years, a politically assertive conservative Christianity became more influential in American politics than it had been in 1945, for instance. But I think you can make a strong case that in the American context, that actually reflected the weakening of religion in American life, and that the Christian Coalition or groups like it are best understood as a kind of reaction to secularization may not be the right word, but the weakening of institutional Christianity, certainly, and the weakening of kind of Christian moral norms in society as a whole. And so if you just say, well, the Christian right is a more important political force, I think that's sort of an incomplete part of the story. The Christian right is a more important political force because as a social and cultural force, perhaps Christianity in the United States is much weaker than it was 60 years ago. And likewise in Europe, I think, most of the sort of resurgence of religious issues and religious and political concerns in secularized Europe in the last 20 or 30 years have had to do with Islam. But there, I think what you're dealing with may be less a case of resurgent religion in a postmodern society than a postmodern society confronting immigrant communities that are still essentially pre-modern. And there, too, I think it isn't necessarily clear that, if you go to what we're seeing as sort of the models of secularized societies, Northern Europe, Scandinavia, even Britain to some extent, that you're seeing a sort of postmodern model of religion really thriving. And again, I would conclude that question again by saying I don't think this is true secularization in the sense that those societies, both Europe and the United States, if you poll people and ask, do you believe in a supreme being? Do you pray? Do you believe in an afterlife? And so on. These societies are still much more religious in that sense than I think Peter Berger, say, would have thought in the 1950s or 60s. But in almost every postmodern society, I don't think it's clear that institutional religion is getting stronger. And I think in many cases it may be getting weaker. And I think that I think may be sort of a complicating factor in our vision of the 21st century as God-centric. So I'll leave my comments there, and thank you all again for having me here to respond.
Thank you, Roland. As moderator, I have the privilege of asking the question, and I'll call on you. But also, let me say, as a moderator of many of these panels, I'm really grateful. I just love it when respondents give every indication they actually read the book.
Between changing diapers.
Especially between changing diapers. But I have a question for each of you, but I'll just leave it with Dan. Dan, I wanted to ask you quickly, what was the, we talked about democracy, Turkey and Indonesia. What do you attribute that to? What kind of Islam is in Turkey and Indonesia that would lead to such democratizing forces, as opposed to the rest of the world?
Yeah. Well, we think that there is diversity of political theology to be found in Islam, and we think those are two powerful cases of Islamic movements coming to advocate democracy. I mean, in the story of Turkey, the Islamic movement is always struggling with being suppressed and confined by a very aggressive secular state founded by Kemal Ataturk, 1924, and so this is the constant challenge. Can it participate at all? There seemed to be kind of every decade a pattern when it finally looked like it was going to win an electoral majority. Then the military warmed up the tanks, and there was a soft coup, and it was suppressed and put down again. Well, around the 70s and 80s, though, the Islamic movement started to change its thinking somewhat. I mean, a kind of pure instrumentalist might say, well, this was, to make itself more acceptable. But I think there's a lot of evidence that, Sufi thinking and what's called the Nursi and Naqshbandi movements, as well as kind of a growing middle class in Islam, created a more kind of modernist, sort of democratic way of thinking. And still there was great tension between the Kemalist state and this Islamic party, but it was one which changed, we argue, changed in its political theology. So as it became more open to democracy, such that when it won in 2002, it was kind of cautiously deemed safe enough to sort of hold the primary position in the coalition. There were other factors too. Turkey came to have an interest in joining the European Union, which put pressure on it to allow the participation of its Islamic party. So there was kind of a give and take there. In Indonesia, it's a very interesting story, somewhat parallel to the Catholic Church in Poland. The Islamic parties, the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama, are really the only parties not to be suppressed under the Suharto dictatorship, very secular dictatorship. 1965 to 1998, they sort of held the torch of some kind of independent civil society alive. And there's a tradition that I think, and there we see it, these Islamic movements have a long historical tradition of being kind of open to pluralism among other religions and coming to have democratic thinking over the course of the 20th century. And so in the late 90s, they were sort of instrumental in kind of leading the popular protests to bring down Suharto because of that.
Any other panelists want to comment on that, or just leave it with Dan? Thank you, Dan, for that. Yes. I will only call on you if you raise your hand. Yep. And could I just follow up on that by saying, and then Dan, when you, after the others respond, Dan, was there a political theology in Indonesia that grew up out of the social forces you just mentioned? Was there a political theology from some faculty members in Turkey that said Islam must start taking these democratic trends? Anyway, okay, who wants to take it first? Tim?
Well, yes, I think what's striking when you look at this kind of historical trajectory that Ross alluded to, and that is an important part of our book, one of the striking things is that you see more and more religious traditions self-consciously developing traditions of political theology they did not necessarily have before. So if you look at Hindu nationalism, or even the Muslim Brotherhood, or American fundamentalists / evangelicals in the United States, many of these traditions had a kind of beginning in which they were very apolitical. They saw themselves as primarily cultural movements or religious movements. But then for a variety of reasons, which we can get into more in the discussion, they really began to self-consciously develop a view of politics. So you had neo-evangelicals in the United States develop a political conscience, responding to the call of Carl Henry and others. You had Hindu nationalists who were very wary of any kind of political involvement, direct political involvement, actually forming a political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party in the 1950s. You had the Muslim Brotherhood, which was originally very wary of direct political involvement, become more open to political involvement. So in some cases, this is actually a relatively new phenomenon, which is not to say that these traditions had no thinking about politics before. But when we talk about political theologies today of many of these groups, we're talking about very modern amalgamations of new ideas, modern ideas, in some cases borrowing from sort of participatory, democratic norms and ideas with traditional ideas, borrowed sort of willy-nilly from an older tradition of political thought. You see this in and also what one might call radical movements as well. Sayyid Qutb or Maulana Maududi, they're thought of as sort of traditionalist or reactionary, but of course their thought is very modern. They blend a very modern view of the state, particularly in the case of Maududi, with a sort of cherry-picking ideas from the Islamic tradition, from Ibn Taymiyyah and so forth. So Ross is absolutely right. You really have to look very carefully at the details of these political theologies. You often have a tradition of political thought in a religious tradition, but then you have political theologies that are operative today, which may differ radically from the kind of the medieval or ancient political tradition in any of these communities.
Yeah, so when we were investigating, we would go and we'd look at actually the religious actors and what they were saying and writings that they drew on in order to legitimate or sort of justify their activities. And so, going and looking at the Iranian school and how they were reinterpreting what it means to be a Shia in the political arena, which was a new development, the idea that you were not supposed to be politically active. And so Tim's right. It actually, I think, is a response, and Ross, you're right on, in response to the emergence of the modern state, which started, centuries and centuries ago. But for many of these societies, this is sort of a new development where the state starts really penetrating And I would say actually not only publicly, but starting to penetrate into the private lives. And then you have religious authorities stepping back and saying, wait a second, how should we sort of operate in this? They're held responsive for saying, okay, what is the proper relationship of the state vis-a-vis these religious actors, institutions, organizations, and what should be our proper response? Sometimes they'll go back, text centuries, but a lot of times it's more modern thinkers sort of reacting to secularism, the modern state, and then also the capacity of these states on the economic front, social front, education. I mean, the state really starts penetrating into the lives much more so. And religious elites, they do have to sort of react to that and respond to that over time.
But just quickly, you also asked about what about sources. And I think one striking failure of the kind of secularized political science we've been talking about is that if you look at political science literature about religion and politics, there really, I would say, is a woeful lack of serious systematic analysis of the particular political theologies of groups. There's a tendency to look at politically active religious groups by analogy to secular organizations. So in other words, they're looked at just as a political party would be looked at, or just as a labor union would be looked at. So their behavior is sort of reduced to categories and patterns that would be familiar to anyone who doesn't know anything about religion. So we really don't have, I think, a very robust literature on the particularities of, say, Hindu nationalist political theology or Shia political theology. There certainly is some things.
That's your next book.
Yeah. So I think this is a real gap in our understanding.
Oh, Ross?
Well, I'll just recommend a couple books. They're not on Hindu political theology. They're on the West, but they actually make a useful sort of parallel reading. One is Mark Lilla's The Stillborn God, which is sort of an interpretation of sort of the West's relationship to political theology. But because I think that book suffers from a slight triumphalism about the sort of secular settlement, I would read that in parallel with a book called Earthly Powers by Michael Berkley, which is a history of what you might call secular religion and religious utopianism in the West. And I think, and I actually think that this book, God's Century, the narrative I was talking about earlier of sort of seeing secularism as having a lot to do with sort of centralization and the aggrandizement of state power is also, I think, a useful corrective to Lilla's vision, which is more likely to sort of see secularism as this perfectly wonderful but also terribly fragile achievement, which it also is. But all these, so those are a couple of recommendations.
Just to follow directly, one of the things that we hope that people take from the book as well is that in many ways we're sort of responding to secularization theory. We are scholars, right? And so the emergence of the state and trying to adjudicate between religious abilities in the state. But one of the interesting things that emerges from the book, and I think reading the historical narrative, is that it's not as clean in even the West. These theories were developed largely to explain the Western experience with the state, and Dan went through some of the examples, whereas it's not as clear cut actually as I think, and actually secular. We now talk about the multiple secularisms, not only beyond the Western, but also within Western countries. We understand there's multiple routes to the secularization process.
I've got about 4 hands up. Dan, do you want to comment quickly or not? You don't have to. Good. I'm going to call on people and ask you to identify yourself, if you would. This gentleman over here, and then this lady here, and then Jim Guth, and then over here. Yes, sir.
My name is John Niskander, and I'm at the Foreign Service Institute. And so my question...
Could you stand up, John, so the rest of the audience can hear you?
Okay, so... Hello? My question, I guess, I want to push back a little bit on the importance of religion in some of these violent movements. So I want to use what I know best, which is the Arab and sort of Islamic examples. And if we take an example, I think that strikes everybody as an obvious one, like the Algerian Civil War. I mean, I won't do, say, Al-Qaeda, but in the Algerian Civil War, you have an Islamist election that is thwarted, and then an Islamist-backed civil war against the government, right? And it was incredibly bloody, like the bloodiest of all the civil wars in the Middle East. I'm sure you guys talk about this to some extent. But one of the things that's really striking in that case is that a lot of times what's happening in the war is that people who are extraordinarily ungrounded, I mean, this is something that's a known phenomenon, right? That the people who are, in many cases, the most extreme, at least in their sort of religious ideology, are often, in fact, the least grounded in religion. So to say about these guys, so often people who have absolutely almost no background, in some cases immigrants to France, come back to Algeria, and are fighting and and doing all kinds of incredibly gory things in the name of the jihad and so on, and yet with very little basis in a sort of study of Islam or something like that. And many people would argue that had they had that study, they wouldn't have gone down that path. So then, wouldn't a way? So I'm not saying that they wouldn't have said, had you asked them, are you fighting in the name of Islam and the jihad? I'm sure they would have said yes. But then, I would think that for you all, you'd be interested also in trying to peel back, and say, well, is this really true? And so this is also a kind of weak argument for a kind of secular ideology or something else other than the religion being the primary thing, even when people argue that it is. So that's just for your reflection.
One thing about Algeria, in one sense, we think it fits our argument pretty well, which is that so the post-colonial regime up to 91, 92, right there when the elections took place under the the FLN government, was almost a signature example of the kind of government that we think prevailed at this time, particularly in Africa and Middle East and Asia, kind of socialist, nationalist, modern, all about modernization and equality, but also fairly authoritarian, and even more so, quite secular. So it ruled in the fashion of Maghreb governments of not denying that we're an Islamic country, but holding a very tight control over Islam and taking one version of Islam, a kind of moderate version, saying this is official for everybody, and then sort of marginalizing the rest. And we think we would tell the story of the civil war in Algeria as being precisely one of religious groups pushing back against this. This is the story that Monica just told of this kind of integration of state and religion. It's the religious groups that are shut out by that then decide to take up arms and then challenge it. Now, political theology is not necessarily, to be influential, is not necessarily good theology. And of course, people in the rank and file can be motivated by religious ideas, but they're not very sophisticated, maybe not authentic ones. If we're certainly not saying that this was necessarily representative of the deep kind of tradition of deep, most thoughtful tradition of Islam by any stretch. But political theology can be held by the average rank and file terrorist or a Timothy McVeigh or what have you, in ways that can be very bizarre sometimes, but still I think we would call it political theology.
Okay, yes ma'am.
My name is Nadia Saad. I'm retired long time from the World Bank. I'm very concerned about what's happening in Egypt. I had a chance to spend 2 years in Cairo with a group that was discussing with the Muslim Brotherhood how about changing Article number 2 of the Constitution. And I must say, I am a bit concerned about what you were discussing, very interesting, but we were discussing practical issues, concrete issues with them for a whole year. And we got nowhere because the issues are real, and this is what, as Mr. Douthat says, this is what we got to go down to now. This discussion is wonderful, but theoretical. Now we have to address real issues. The issue of the attitude of Islam to science. The issue why they refuse to sign the Declaration of Human Rights. The issue of morality, the role of women. We spent a whole year with a group of around the National New Civic Forum that was liberal thinking institute. I want to say that the cadre of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is 20 years to develop a real view of political Islam and what it means, and they do make sense. So, and there is nothing on the other side to counter them. We have meetings with representatives of all the political parties, and nobody makes sense except them. So I'm very concerned because on the other side you have a group of Copt Egyptians here who are being fed by all kinds of, political people, and they have a television, and they are creating. I'm just back from Egypt. I have never seen. I'm grown up in Egypt. Never seen the Copts being worked up so much in a violent way to react and defend themselves against Islam. So I'm very concerned about what's happening now, and I can see violence being built up. Is there any chance that a group like you people would focus on real issues?
Okay, thank you. Who wants to address the real practical issues on the ground now as we speak? Who would like to take that? Tim?
To your last question, I'm tempted to say no, that we're not quite prepared to handle a concrete issue as difficult as that one. But it's a central question, and of course we need to try to address it. There are lots of legitimate concerns and worries about the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, and I take it that behind your question is a sense of anxiety, as a number of members of our foreign policy establishment and analysts of politics today are expressing. Namely, is it safe to include into a democratic process groups that may be unreliably democratic? In other words, if a group is not fully reliably democratic, how do you actually allow them to be involved in the political process? Is that am I?
They believe they are more democratic than you.
Yeah.
The reason is that they refuse. I was in Algeria when they were in the 1992 discussing the election. What they were saying is that how could you let the majority in the parliamentary system win, rule the game? Because if it is a majority of one or two, how would you let yourself and God will be ruled by a sort of mechanical something that you can buy? So they are, of course, talking about consensus, and this is another.
Right. In a sense, in a situation like that, you really have only two alternatives. It seems to me, and I think it seems to us as we argue in the book. You can either try to encourage groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood to be full-fledged, legitimate players in the political process, or you can find ways of systematically excluding them. There really aren't any other options. Charles Krauthammer, a couple of weeks ago, has articulated the second of those options. He actually explicitly argued that the United States should make it absolutely clear, yes, we believe in democracy, except for people who are Islamists. That let everybody in the political process do as we did during the Cold War in Western Europe. Support democratic systems, but don't pretend that we would be happy if the communists take over Italy. Let's not pretend that we'll be happy if Islamists take over Egypt in a democratic election. So let's try to tilt the system however we can. I think it's clear that without getting into the details about specific groups, and a case like the Muslim Brotherhood is a very complex one. We're not Egypt specialists or specialists on the Muslim Brotherhood. And there are many legitimate disagreements about the character of the Muslim Brotherhood. It has a complex history. It's a complex organization. There are many different kinds of leaders and factions in the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think the burden of our book is that if you take seriously the two choices that we've advanced, you can either try to include a group or you can exclude it. Far greater danger, as far as we see, lies in excluding a group like that. And we think that there is evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood is complex enough, has evolved enough, As, for example, the great human rights activist in Egypt, Said Ibrahim, will say, who actually spent years in prison with Muslim Brotherhood leaders and has talked with them hours and hours, years and years on end about what they learned in prison, about how to address the system in Egypt. People like that sincerely believe that the Muslim Brotherhood, having renounced violence, is a group that can be permitted to participate in the political process. Again, if your choices are exclude or include, we believe that far more good and far less harm would come if you include a group like that. And there is precedent all over the world for including groups, religious groups, that may in some respects pose dangers for or tensions with democracy, for permitting them to be part of the political process and actually being able to watch over time a kind of moderation, a kind of maturation, and also, frankly, a kind of splintering. Oftentimes, a hard-nosed group that's highly ideological over time will splinter into factions, as has already happened in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a centrist party that split off of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is now permitted to compete in Egyptian elections, called the Wasat Party, the Center Party. This is happening with the Hindu nationalist movement in India, which in some respects is an illiberal and arguably anti-democratic force, and yet they participate openly in Indian elections and are a full part of the political process. Would we be happier if the Indian government systematically excluded that movement from the political process? Would that movement be less dangerous or more dangerous? We think groups that are systematically excluded, suppressed, and marginalized are far more dangerous when they're kept out of the political system than when they're integrated into the political system as much as possible.
Tim, I have about 5 or 6 more hands that have been going up, but Ross is a specialist on the Muslim Brotherhood. I thought he might want to at least make a comment.
I trust that was a joke.
It was.
As a journalist, I'm a specialist in absolutely nothing. But
But I
guess
knew you'd have an opinion.
I do have an. Well, no, I don't have an opinion. I think it's an enormous dilemma facing, and I mean, I suppose you could say it's a dilemma that, in a sense, is out of Western hands to some extent. So, you know, it is kind of an academic question. The future of Egypt is in the hands of Egyptians, and that's true around the Middle East. But I think the problem for Western policymakers is pretty simple. I think there's sort of the short-term interest and the long-term interest, right? And in the long-term interest, I think what Tim says is absolutely true, that ultimately progress in the Middle East can only come through some sort of gradual inclusion of religious parties in the political process, because participating in the political process is sort of it's the sine qua non of ultimate moderation, and I think you can see this happen all around the world, and you can see it happen in the Middle East. You can see it happen to some extent in a place like Iran, where Iran is obviously not a liberal society, but in certain respects it has more of a chance of becoming a liberal society now, arguably, because it has endured 30 years of a kind of quasi-democratic religious dictatorship. And this is an argument that's been advanced by, I think, most eloquently by Real Mark Gerecht, who has a book, I want to say it's The Paradox of Islamic Democracy. But basically this is his argument that what you see in Iraq with religious parties, what you may be about to see in Egypt, all of this is a necessary process. That the way to get groups to moderate is to put them in charge of the sewer system, right? And that this is sort of how it worked in the West, and it's how it has to work everywhere. The problem is that in the short term, that's a pretty hard thing to say to let's say you're a middle-class woman in Baghdad, right? It's pretty hard to go to that woman and say, by the way, for the sake of Iraq 30 years from now, you're going to have to live with religious parties sort of telling you how to dress, right? Or worse. Or to say, well, look, in the long run, Iran's going to be better off because it had this, semi-theocratic dictatorship. And it's a hard thing to say. And so I think it's, from the point of view of policymakers, whether in the State Department or the White House or wherever else, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is just a great example of this problem. It's like, well, and it's the same thing with Hamas in Gaza, right? It's like, well, you have the election, and you make Hamas be responsible for the sewer system, right? And that, in the long run, will lead to splintering and moderation and all the rest of it. But in the short term, Hamas is in charge of Gaza. So I don't have an opinion. I just have, an explanation of the dilemma.
Thank you very much. James Guth was next, and then this gentleman over here, this young lady here, and then this gentleman here, here, and there. Professor Guth, you're up.
Jim Guth, Furman University. I'm going to relieve you guys from the down-to-earth stuff and get back to theory here for a second, drawing on something that Ross mentioned a little bit earlier. When I assigned this book along with Norris and Engelhardt on the trend of religion in the modern world, my students are going to be utterly confounded. And not having read the book yet, I see obviously some conflict with the basic perspective there. And I'm wondering if you would address how you have, where you see that, kind of cross-national work intersect with your own, or where yours fits in a way that, in a sense, detracts from their overall argument about the continuation of the secularization process.
Yeah, I can address it a little bit. Pippa Norris is at my fine institution at the Kennedy School, and I respect her work a lot. But I think she is coming out of sort of the Western secularization thesis. And her data seem to support part of the story. And so we don't deny that. So if you read the book...
Can you summarize what she argues?
So the argument basically is that the world is becoming more secular, both in terms of belief and practice. The United States is an outlier, but and their argument is that as the world becomes more modern and prosperous, people are more secure and they don't need God as much, right? The modern state is actually providing for needs.
That was made 40 years ago, right?
Yeah, but now she has the World Values Survey to back her up, right? And so it's all surveys since the 1970s to back up that thesis. And the data in some corners of the world do seem to support that argument. And then how do you explain the United States? So Engelhardt and Norris make the argument that the United States, as the individualized society where we don't have public health care and everything, we're more insecure in the United States, therefore we're more religious. Well, I don't know, I think that's a real reach. So when we, discuss these sort of theories, we say, look, there do seem to be some corners of the world. Ross, you put it in terms of postmodernist, non-institutionalized religiosity in Europe. There does seem to be support for this. On the other hand, when you really start breaking down, so when you teach this, put her charts up, and then really go country by country. Ireland is pretty religious still. Poland is pretty religious. There are some, Denmark, the Danes, and there was just this great report put out, I want to say in The Guardian, about these guys who were talking about the censuses. So they run out these models showing that there are certain, that religion is dying in certain countries. And actually Denmark was not one of them, and I'm really surprised. I want to get that data set and play with that. But Ireland is one of them, where they say, if you look at demographically speaking, religion is going to die in the next couple of decades in Ireland. But we're not necessarily convinced. First of all, more recent data are showing that in some parts of Western Europe, religion is flat, meaning that beliefs are not necessarily going down. And so that's a really interesting thing. The question is why? Is it the reaction to immigrants coming in and saying, I'm Muslim, I'm Buddhist, I deserve, to be able to practice my faith publicly? And the European Christian majority is then reacting sort of to that. So that's one aspect of it. And then they cannot explain most of the world. They can explain Western Europe and Japan. If you buy the argument about the United States being insecure vis-a-vis these other then perhaps the United States. I tend not to buy that argument. And then you look at the rest of the world, and their book just does not hold up. It turns out that much of the world is becoming more religious, not less. 80% of the world still believes in God. It's very important to them, and that number has gone up in the last 7 years. The data have shown that. And people over time, Pew surveys are showing this, want their public officials to be more religious, to exude religiosity in the public arena, and those numbers are going up as well. Not in Europe. We're not saying Europe does seem to be, people talk about de-Christianizing, but there still is a powerful set of people in Europe, and the majority who still believe in God and think that God is very important. And those numbers are about 60%. I'm sorry. I just don't think that that's, absolutely definitive evidence that religion is dead in Europe.
But Professor Guth, you will promise now to assign both books.
I will, and I'm glad that Monica gives the same lecture I give on that.
I would let others respond, but we've got about 4 or 5 more people to get in. This gentleman is very patient. Yes, sir.
I'm Timothy. I'm a graduate student here at the government department, and as someone who does research on comparative, politics and religion, I actually very much appreciate, empirically coherent, but also, like theoretically ambitious work. So that's great. I look forward to reading the book. Now, as someone who also does this, how do you wrestle with the low data quality on religion that you have? Right? So you put this out a number of times, but then you show all these charts, right? And how confident are you that your perceptions of these things are not just being shaped by dominant narratives? For example, right? So like Islam is dominantly discussed in terms of violence, but is this because this is how we observe Islam, with a very like notoriously tainted glasses? And same with Catholicism and democratization, right? So how do you get around that? And any advice for young scholars?
Again?
We use other people's data.
I guess one thing is we use other people's data, and we use lots of it. And so what we hope is we don't rely on any one datum, one point. We try to triangulate, and as I said, this resurgence is not happening everywhere. But we rely heavily on a lot of other people's data. And we try not to be biased. Like Islam, when I first started, in fact, I was shocked when I started to work on the civil wars, how disproportionately involved Muslim societies were, right? It was distressing, right? Because here I am, a scholar, and I don't want to be beating up on Muslim societies. Yet the data are there, and we think in part it's because of the democratization, decolonization. They're still relatively young states, right? So in any event, so what we try to do is we try to accumulate and bring together as much data as possible. We looked at religious beliefs as well as religious behavior, right? Because there's differences, and you talked about, I think what you're referring to, Ross, is behavior. Europeans just don't go to church, but they still believe in God or gods, whatever that might be. So trying to amass as much data, and then trying to come to terms with data that don't seem to confirm what we look at. So if you work the World Values Survey, they have an amazing, if you're starting to look at it, it's amazing the questions, and you can sort of triangulate through different questions to an answer that you think would be more fully satisfying about, am I really capturing the beliefs here that I'm trying to get at?
Okay. Amen. Okay, this young lady right here, please.
I'm Crystal. I'm a grad student in public policy here. My question is related to, you mentioned that religious groups that are suppressed by the state are more likely to become violent under the action. So I'm going to speak specifically about like religious groups that were sponsored, nurtured, really equipped, trained, what have you, by the state.
Can you stand and let others hear you?
So religious groups that were nurtured by the Pakistani state have now turned on that state. And there's external influences, obviously, but the dominant narrative for these groups was really to protect the Islamic State or whatever. And so have you found in your research that has happened before, or do you have any sort of explanation for what's going on?
In a sense, our argument about religion and violence is a two-pronged argument. You can get violence when groups are systematically suppressed over time, as happened in Algeria, for example. The systematic exclusion and then suppression of Islamist groups created a kind of conflagration of violence. But there's another side of the argument, which is that when you have a situation where a state and a religious entity form a kind of alliance, and particular religious groups receive special privileges and sponsorship and power, then that also can generate violence on the part of those uniquely legitimated groups against parts of society that don't conform to that official religious ideology. So Pakistan is really a powerful example of the second kind of dynamic, which has really arguably been built into the very logic of Pakistani national identity since the founding of Pakistan. Because what justified the foundation of Pakistan? Essentially religious differentiation, the idea that this, if not an Islamic State really needed to be a homeland for Muslims. And that gradually led to a sense that Islam was an essential defining feature of the Pakistani nation and state, which gradually then allowed thinkers such as Maulana Maududi a kind of oversized influence. Even though they couldn't get very many votes when they actually ran for office, the Jamaat-e-Islami, they nevertheless were given a kind of privileged role in relation to the state, in terms of defining what Pakistani Islam was. And that then has created just the situation you're describing. It's created a kind of dynamic whereby certain privileged groups that are being used partly for foreign policy purposes by Pakistan, partly for the purposes of shoring up an otherwise weak national identity, especially a country which has very deep ethnic cleavages, as you know. Islam is the glue that kind of holds Pakistan together. Certain kinds of groups have a special role in shoring up national identity against Shia, against ethnic secessionists, and these groups use violence, legitimated by the state, in order to do that. So it shows Pakistan shows another part of our argument, which creates a very difficult foreign policy challenge for the United States.
Okay, Rebecca Samuel Shaw.
How much of this phenomenon
You must stand up, please, and not address your husband.
How much of this phenomenon, I'd like to ask, I'm a demographer, is a demographic phenomenon? Is it the youth that are finding religion? Or are there, what will happen when these young Egyptians get older? Will they still be as religious? Or does it just come in waves, as Professor Huntington himself talks about?
One thing I was going to say, just a gloss on Monica's discussion of Engelhardt and Norris. So they find this, what they argue is a sharp relationship between, inverse relationship between wealth or more comfort, more human security, and you become more secular when you become more comfortable and more wealthy. And so that's a relationship, but it's not necessarily an aggregate finding. I think Engelhardt later clarified that he thought that the world is actually still a very religious place, maybe even becoming more of a religious place, because that part of the globe which is religious is the part that's multiplying in its population. The poorer part, the less developed, are having many more kids. And so that part that is expected to be religious is only getting larger. I think is one important demographic thing to note. That's a part of the world where we would expect religion only to increase. I think, the idea of youth finding religion is something that we've seen before. I think in Egypt, it's very interesting when religion began to be politically mobilized. It was really in the 1970s, and it was among students. There was kind of a lot of fermentation on the campuses, and we're wanting to kind of mobilize a much more political version of Islam and assert it in the society, in the government, in the civil society, and of course we see a youth bulge now in the Arab Spring. So I think this is the idea of the rediscovery of religion when it becomes sort of mobilized politically. It often does happen among the youth, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that in the Islamic resurgence and evidence for that in the Arab Spring today.
But one thing I would add is, so usually the modernization thesis is absolutely about sort of development, an industrial machine and then providing for societies. But I think one of the interesting things that modernization theory misses is sort of the vacuous nature of the ideologies and secularism. And so the moral order question, which religion provides, right? And so one of the interesting things, I think, actually, is not necessarily religion being the opiate of the masses. In some places it is, right? The religious, 50% of aid internationally is dealt out by religious actors and institutions and that. But in a lot of corners of the world, in Egypt, these are middle-class revolutions. People actually have houses, not all in every corner. I understand there's rural areas, but there's something that religion provides, a sense of, it's not even certainty, it's that you know who you are as an individual in this world, in this moral cosmic order, that these secular ideologies didn't provide. And modernization, secularization theorists miss this. And so when they make the argument about needs, it really is about material needs. Whereas I think part of this global resurgence that we really want to stress in this book, and why the political theology is so important, is that it provides a sense of a moral compass that these secular ideologies did not provide, or they actually did provide it. It was going to be the end of man, and everybody was going to be happy in communism at the end of history. That failed, right? And that individualism was denied. Whereas what religion does quite powerfully is allow for individuals to own their values, right? To have sort of this individual relationship with a god or gods or some sort of moral order that these other ideologies in the modern system failed to provide. Which is why, by the way, I think, Ross, in response to you, why in Europe you still see a majority of people still having a sense of belief in God.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the sign of a good panel when you have 3 questions to go and you're overtime. And we are overtime. And should we take one more minute, Tim, or should we end like we always say if we get one
You
time?
gather the questions. Everybody has them.
Well, Erica's been waiting. Erica, you can have one. Erica, you get the
Thank
last
you.
question. You get the last
I don't know
question.
if I don't know if it's a good enough question, but I'll go for it. My focus is religious pluralism in the United States, so this is a very U.S.-centric question. But I'm thinking about over time, as areas of the world potentially become more democratic, how that will affect the language that's used in political debate. And so if we read the discourse on John Rawls or Jeff Stout or Milbank, there's this discussion of what is the role of religious language in our democratic debates. And for very pragmatic reasons here in the United States, because we have such a plurality of religious groups represented who do come to the political sphere with their strong religious and moral values, we still can't have Supreme Court justices giving religious rationale for why they rule on things, and the First Amendment protects against that. So my question is, over time, it's hard to predict the future, but as we see greater roles of religious groups in the democratic processes around the world, if this happens, can we expect that, as you mentioned, there will be a factioning of those voices, greater plurality of religious opinions over time, and just for very pragmatic reasons, not even ideological reasons, not even the necessity of a First Amendment, we see the secularization of political language just because we see greater plurality in those parts of the world.
Okay, who wants to answer the question?
I think it's certainly plausible, and it would be easy to multiply cases where that might seem to operate. On the other hand, it might be that the opening up of democratic space and the kind of pluralization of society that's caused by democratization and political opening may actually increase a sense of fragmentation, and therefore a sense of a kind of felt need for a unifying framework that might come from religion. Pakistan is perhaps an example. It's in many ways a very pluralistic society. It's had many democratic elections, and yet that this kind of sense of fragmentation and some political contestation competition has actually not diminished a kind of yearning for religious language and framework, but actually probably intensified that yearning. And one can look at other cases, the kinds of cases that we probably leave in shadow, as Ross was saying, Western European cases. Germany, for example, the current debate in Germany about Leitkultur and the need to go beyond multiculturalism. It's not framed in explicitly religious terms, but one can imagine, if not Germany, other Western European societies taking a sort of harder look at their religious heritage and asking whether precisely to define and strengthen a sense of national identity in the face of large immigration, in the face of immigrant populations that may not have assimilated very successfully. Maybe that some of these societies will actually turn to religion in a somewhat stronger way. In a way, interestingly, that Jürgen Habermas, the great theorist of secular vision of democracy, has suggested that democracies actually, in some sense, arguably need something other than the Enlightenment, precisely in order to ground human rights and to ground a sense of liberal, of a kind of a unified liberal polity.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our panel for